Tonight, and mercifully for you, we've got a good speaker tonight. We have a great speaker tonight. And some of you know Leo and have seen him speak before. So I know that you're prepared not only to be educated, but to be entertained. Leo and Nancy are the owners, operators, curators of the Jenney Museum in Plymouth. And Leo is the education coordinator, is that the proper title? And, just really giving the true story of the Pilgrims in Plymouth, as opposed to what you might find at some other institutions. Author, historian, and just really a great person. And I'm not going to say anything else beyond that, except to welcome Leo. Tell us about the impact of the Pilgrims.
Hello. Thank you for having me, everybody. It's wonderful to be here. Again, my wife and I, Nancy, run the Jenney Museum in Plymouth, Massachusetts, where we tell the truth about the founding of our country. And it's kind of an unusual thing, but that's what we do. We have a museum that was built in 1749, and it's on the original site of Plymouth Plantation. Our museum sits right along a river. On one side of the river, on the hill, was Wampanoag's village, the Indian village. On the other side of our river, on the opposite hill, was Plymouth Plantation. So our river runs right down the middle. What I like to tell people when we bring them to Plymouth is I give tours of the whole town of Plymouth. I give walking tours telling the history of our country, and I begin at the mill, the Jenney Grist Mill, which is right behind our building. Nancy and I ran the Jenney Grist Mill for 10 years before we ran our museum. So while we ran the Jenney Grist Mill, I was known as Leo the Miller. Well, we no longer run the mill, so they had to change my name. They changed my name from Leo the Miller to Leo the Husband. And this is the reason why. In our museum, we tell the people, we have an exhibit called Family Cornerstone of Society, where we talk about the importance of the family, so I am now Leo the Husband. Of course, the question would be this: am I qualified? I believe I am. My wife and I have been married for 45 years. On the other hand, you may want to ask her. Always good to confirm. Now, we begin our tour at the Jenney Grist Mill. By the way, the Jenney Grist Mill is the oldest mill, site of the oldest mill built in the country. Originally built in 1636. As you folks know, our Pilgrims didn't land in Plymouth at all in the beginning, but they landed way up on the tip of Cape Cod in Provincetown. Seeing that it was all sand up there and not a great spot for a plantation, what they did is put a little boat together they carried with them on the Mayflower. We call the boat a shallop. They looked all over Cape Cod for a place to stay, found our river and stayed there, simply because our river gave them three things they had to have. The first is water power. See, the name of our river is Town Brook. It's 1.5 miles long. But in 1.5 miles, it drops 80 feet. Good place to put a mill. Such a good place, we had 14 mills on the river within 1.5 miles. But again, keep in mind, our mill, the Jenney Mill, was the site of the oldest mill in the country, built in 1636. Folks, the second thing about our river, if it never rained in Plymouth again, the water level will never drop. Our river is spring-fed. We've got a constant flow of water coming out of the ground. The ground in Plymouth also has sand in it. When the water comes up through the sand, it is filtered. It does run into the river fresh drinking water. They got drinking water and water power. But you folks, you're all smart. You know sand's good for filtering, not good for growing corn. We do have to fertilize heavily, and the river supplies that. Folks, our fertilizer are fish. We call them herring. Herring live in the ocean, but when they spawn up in our pond. Every spring they migrate by the mill. Pilgrims take them out of the river, put them in the ground, fertilize, and grow the corn. Oh, by the way, they did go upstream for 6 weeks this spring. We had a little over 165,000 fish go by the building. For 6 weeks, you cannot see the bottom of our river. It is solid fish. Or 165 go up to 65,000. go up a 3-foot wide canal called a fish ladder. We have all the fertilizer, water power, and fresh water you could use, all supplied by that river. Not a bad place to put a plantation. Well, especially if you consider they were 200 miles off course. Something just happened to work out, folks. Again, right on the river, one side we have Burial Hill, the original site of Plymouth Plantation. The other side, Watson's Hill, the original site of Habermock's Village, the Indian Village. But folks, keep this in mind. We established Plymouth in 1620, Habermock's Village, 1623, 3 years after the arrival of the Pilgrims. Not because the Indians weren't here first, of course they were. But they did not establish that village for 3 years after the Pilgrims arrived. And folks, there's a reason for it. See, in Plymouth, we primarily talk about a tribe of Indians called the Wampanoag and their chief Massasoit. We did have one other tribe in Plymouth called the Pawtuxet Indians. Pawtuxet means small river. They were named after our river. Now, folks, before Pilgrims came to Plymouth, hunters would come from Europe, hunt and go back home. On occasion, they would invite Indians aboard their ships to trade with them, capture them as slaves, and take them back to Europe. One of those Indians' name was Squanto. Squanto was a Pawtuxet Indian. He was invited aboard a ship by a hunter by the name of Hunt. Can't make this stuff up, can you? Unbelievable, yeah. Hunt takes him back to Europe. He escapes to a monastery, learns English. 6 months before the Pilgrims come, he comes back on another ship to discover the Pawtuxet Indians wiped out by a plague. He went into mourning with Massasoit and the Wampanoag. 6 months later, the Pilgrims arrived. He became the interpreter between the Pilgrims and the Indians. Folks, that's the only way they could communicate. Governor William Bradford did refer to him as a special gift from God. But folks, the reason I bring it up is when people come to Plymouth, they are either told or believe that the Pilgrims stole the land from the Indians. They did not. The Indians did not want the land. They would not come back on it because of the plague. The Pilgrims took land nobody wanted. Everything after that they paid for to the chief Massasoit. Folks, this is very important. If we can't own property, we have absolutely no power. Whoever owns the property we do business on will be our master. We will be their slave. We have to have the ability to own property. And the number one property our Pilgrims believed they owned and nobody had a right to touch was their conscience, what they believed. Folks, what you believe is your property. Nobody has a right to take it from you. And that's why our Pilgrims came to Plymouth. There was a gentleman back in England trying to take the property of what they believed away from them. They would not allow it. They came here instead. Of course, that gentleman's name is Jim. You may know him as King James. Anybody here ever wonder why Plymouth is called America's hometown? Jamestown was first. They came in 1607. We came in 1620. Why are we America's hometown? We brought families. Did you folks know that Jamestown did not have women for 12 years? They went there to strike it rich. We came here to build a society, and us Pilgrim men, we're so darn smart, we knew we couldn't do it without women. How sharp are we, huh? But folks, we also brought children. Absolutely unheard of. But if you're going to start a society, you bring the cornerstone, the family. We did, and it worked. Unfortunately, when I tell folks that, they assume our children were uneducated because they didn't have a formal school. And folks, they didn't. We didn't have enough children. But believe me, they were well educated. They learned at home. Their parents taught them. They even had a textbook back then. We call that textbook the Bible today. They had supplementary materials. Governor Bradford himself brought over 400 books with him on the Mayflower. The governor could speak 5 languages. Let me see if I can put this education thing in perspective. Right down the street a little ways from here, right here in Massachusetts, there's a little institution that was built the same year our Grist Mill was built, 1636. You may have heard of it. We call it Harvard University. Harvard was founded when a young man named John Harvard donated his library to start the university. William Bradford brought more books with him on the Mayflower than John Harvard donated to Harvard University. Kind of puts things in perspective. See, folks, that's how important education is. But not more important than education itself for the Pilgrims was the source of their education. And the source of the Pilgrim education was the Bible. We'll get to that later. Let's get back to this King James thing, okay? What's the problem we have with King James? Well, guys, King James was the King of England, and he was the head of the Anglican Church. When King James set the law in England, he set the law for everybody. Everybody in England sat under the same rule of law, except King James. He was above the law. He didn't have to follow his own law. Not only that, if you belonged to his church, the Anglican Church, and you wanted to pray, knock your lights out, pray all day long, as long as the subject of your prayer was King James. He thought he was God, divine right of kings. Well, kind of rubbed our pastor the wrong way. John Robinson, the pastor of the Pilgrims, took his folks out of the Anglican Church, and we had church in our homes. In other words, folks, the Pilgrims separated from the Church of England. That's why we're called separatists. See, there was another group back then, theologically similar to the Pilgrims, who stayed in the Anglican Church and tried to purify it from within. We call them the Puritans. They came 10 years later and founded Boston. But folks, this is a very big difference. Because when John Robinson did that, separated from the church, he never wanted to see one person in charge of everything ever again, like the king. So he had his congregation elect him pastor, not appoint him. Appoint him, you can't get rid of him. Elect him, you can dump him. But folks, do you know what that did for us? That started self-rule in our country. The result, the Mayflower Compact, first document to self-rule, where we elected John Carver, the first freely elected official in the United States, all based on the fact that Robinson never wanted to see one person in charge of everything ever again. However, that did not make King James happy. Our Pilgrims were forced out of England, went to Holland for 12 years where they could worship freely. While in Holland, the congregation grew to over 300 people. When they came here 12 years later, Pastor Robinson had to stay back with the majority of the congregation. A gentleman by the name of William Brewster came in his place and did all the preaching. But folks, he was not a preacher by trade, he was a printer. And while in England, he printed materials against the Anglican Church. That also did not make King James happy. Brewster had to jump on the Mayflower and get out of town. Had he been caught, he would have been imprisoned. Unfortunately, his partner, Thomas Brewer, did not make it. Spent the next 14 years in prison where he died. Just giving you an outline of an incredible story. Folks, I'm a historian. And when I tell a historic story, I like to tell a human story. I'm a historian, and I can't stand textbooks. They're boring. A human story. What really happened with these people? Which might want to bring us to the next point. Where in the world did John Robinson come up with this self-rule thing in the first place? Guys, back then there was no self-rule. Everything was tyrannical. Well, I'm going to be honest with you. He came up with it because the Pilgrims were a product of a little bump in the road back in Europe in the 15 and 1600s. We call that bump in the road the Reformation. And because at that time people could read the Bible for the first time, they discovered they no longer needed a king or a priest or a bishop to intercede between them and God. They could talk to God themselves. In other words, they could pray. But here's the thing with the Pilgrims. They thought God talked back to them. It was a two-way conversation. Well, folks, if you go from a place in your life where someone's talking to God for you to having a two-way conversation, you're certainly going to change. Your faith will be different, your moral standard. And folks, faith and morality are what we call an inward governance, a change on the inside. And whoever you are on the inside will reflect who you are on the outside. So Robinson's reading the Old Testament. Comes across a little passage called the Dominion Charter. We should take dominion over the earth, over the animals, fish, things that creep and crawl. But he also read this, not each other. See, Robinson read we're all made in the image of God. Well, if that is true, if we're all made in the image of God, then no human being has a right to be above another human being without their consent. Folks, self-rule is a biblical principle. You cannot have civil government self-rule without biblical law. Can't happen. And the way I like to explain it to people is this. Want me to be the king? Happy to do it. I'll take the job. And you know what I'm going to do today? I'm going to set the law. You know what I'm going to do next week? Change it in my favor. But I can't change God's law. Guys, without that truth, without that constant, you cannot have a civil government. And that's where our country came from today. Now, does this mean I believe our country was founded on biblical principles? Does that mean you have, on Christian principle? Does that mean you have to be a Christian to be in the country? No. All it means is everybody's equal under the same law. A law we can't change. And that's the beginning of our country. See, we have this king that thinks he's God. Now what do we have? Who's the king now? You. Me. We're the king. Which means what? If I break the same law Governor William Bradford breaks, we're both equal. He gets the same punishment that I get. Nobody's now above the law. But of course, folks, that does come with responsibility. And that responsibility for us is to pick people to be in government that deserve to be there, that have character, that have integrity. That's our job. So to be king, to have a civil government, we have a responsibility, people, to pay attention. Let me bring myself up to today for a minute. Tough place to have an election, old Massachusetts, isn't it? Yeah. And I think, personally, a lot of elections, we don't have much of a choice, do we? You put people up in that place, and the choice is difficult. Which lesser of two evils do we pick? That's our fault. Because we didn't put people up there that deserve to be up there. So with this little civil government thing comes a responsibility. And what we just did with the Pilgrims, oh, by the way, if anybody has a problem with what I'm talking about and the faith and all that, blame the Pilgrims. I'm just telling you a factual story. With the Pilgrims, we just changed the order of how things happen. The Mayflower Compact. Anybody ever read the Mayflower Compact? It's pretty interesting. And it does bring to light a lot of the things I've just been telling you. Let me see if I have a copy of it here. I probably, there it is. The Mayflower Compact. Ready? In the name of God, amen. The first line. In the name of God, amen. We whose names are underwritten, the royal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord, King James, by the grace of God, of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, defender of the faith, having undertaken the glory of God. Here's the point. In the name of God, amen, those names who are underwritten subjects of the king. Did you just see a change in the order? The king believes God, king, people. The Mayflower Compact tells you God, people, king. Civil government. Without that, folks, we can't have a civil government. So as you can see, the order of the Mayflower Compact was changed simply because John Robinson, the pastor of the Pilgrim Church, had this experience telling him the king is not the king. There's only one king, and he's not on earth. So that's where we came from. That's where our civil government started, with our Pilgrims. Does that, do you think, have any influence on the Constitution? I believe so. On the Declaration of Independence? I believe so. Because what our forefathers, us, did is pass that information to the Founding Fathers, and we started this wonderful Constitution and Declaration of Independence. Now, of course, a lot of people say to me, well, there's no mention of faith in the Constitution. It's not there. Of course it's there. It might not say it specifically, but where'd it come from? It came from the faith and from the Pilgrims. That's where it came from. So I just want to give you an outline of what happened here with the Pilgrims. An amazing story. Were our Pilgrims perfect? I don't believe so. But they tried to be better tomorrow than they were today. And they treated everybody equal under the law. Did you know we signed a peace treaty with the Indians, folks? Peace treaty lasted 55 years. Longest lasting peace treaty with the Indians in our country's history. Why do we sign a peace treaty with the Indians? Because we're all equal under the law. If we're going to come here to fight the tyranny of a man who believes he's above the law, to start a society where we're all equal under the law, under the same law, what do you do with the people you meet? What do you do with the Indians? Should they be equal under our law? Absolutely. We wrote that handwritten 6-point peace treaty. Did they test it? Oh, you bet. 1630, 3 Europeans killed an Indian on the Rhode Island border. 2 were captured and brought back to Plymouth for a trial. One of the 3 judges that sat in on that trial, a gentleman named Jenney. He built the Grist Mill. Naturally, the Indians thought it would be a joke, a mock trial, go through the motions, get it over with, let them go. After all they did was kill an Indian. Jenney found the 2 men guilty and had them hung. Everybody was equal under the law. Now the Indians could trust the Pilgrims. They were people of character and integrity who stood by their word. And I do believe that is why that peace treaty ended up being the longest lasting peace treaty in our country's history. Simply because the Pilgrims stood by their word. Pilgrims started a whole new movement here, folks. Again, civil government. Jamestown didn't have that. We had an election every year. How'd you like to do that, Mark? Every year.
Feels like it.
I don't think so, yeah. An election every year. We came as families. Do you know, if I took you around Plymouth, I would show you 2 statues of women. I'd show you 1 Indian, 1 Pilgrim, 2 women. In no colony in our country will you see 2 statues of women other than Plymouth, because we honored our women. Without our women, we would not have survived. We have 1 statue called the Pilgrim Maiden. That statue represents the 14 single women that came on the Mayflower. We have another statue called the Pilgrim Mother. Represents the 18 married women. Did you folks know that when we originally came to Plymouth, we had 2 ships? One called the Speedwell, one called the Mayflower. We owned the Speedwell, we leased the Mayflower. The Speedwell picked our friends up in Holland, brought them to England, met the Mayflower, and came over. When they left England, the Speedwell leaked twice. They had to sell it for half what they paid for it, lost their investment. 20 of the original passengers had to stay behind, and they left late. When they landed on the tip of Cape Cod, they had run out of food. The men looked around the Cape, found a stash of corn buried in the ground by the Indians, and they took it. Folks, they did not steal the corn, they borrowed it, they paid it back later. Had they not taken the corn, they never would have survived. Because you see, by the end of that first winter, they were doling out a 1/4 pound of cornbread per person per day to survive on. So as you can well imagine, the mothers took their bread and fed their children. They covered their children with their own bodies to keep them warm. Of those 18 married women, 14 died the first winter, sacrificing themselves for the next generation, knowing if they did not survive, we would not survive. And written on the back of that statue, it says, they brought their families in a sturdy virtue and a living faith in God, without which nations perish. And while the women were making that tough decision, the men were making another one. Hold back some of that corn. If they had no seed for the first season, nobody would have survived. They called that the starving time. What commitment? And I'm commonly asked when I tell a story like that, what would cause somebody to do this? What would cause somebody to have this commitment? Another question they asked me is, how do you pick 20 people to stay behind when your boat leaks? They didn't have to. 20 volunteered. You see, those two starts were very rough. 20 had no problem staying behind. One of them was not William Bradford. When that happened, William Bradford said this: like Gideon's army, the Lord thought us too many for the task at hand and cut our number down. And he got on the boat. In other words, he was saying, if you're not committed, stay home. And at the end of that first season, when the Mayflower got ready to go back to England, Captain Jones turned to those 51 remaining Pilgrims and he said to them, get back on my ship. I'm taking you home. I can't leave you here. Not one got back on. But I will tell you this. When that boat disappeared over the horizon, those 51 remaining Pilgrims fell on their knees and they wept. The last bit of civilization as they knew it just disappeared. So again, the question is this: why did they do it? Folks, they did it for you. They did it for me. They did it for posterity. They did it to pass that biblical law to the next generation. And they did. To the founding fathers. But anybody here ever notice how hard that is to do? Anybody notice that we have an issue with the next generation? Difficult to pass stuff to them. I don't know what the problem is. Is it them not taking it? Or is that us not passing it right? Probably both. Do you think it was just today? I don't think so. I can take you down the waterfront and show you a beautiful statue of a gentleman by the name of Massasoit, the chief of the Wampanoag Indians. And back in the 1600s, the Wampanoags lived right in Plymouth, and on Cape Cod, and in New Bedford, and in Rhode Island. He was chief of all of them, very important man. But he was our friend. Without Massasoit, the Pilgrims would not have survived. But also keep this in mind, 3 years into that peace treaty, Massasoit was at his camp in Rhode Island. The man had the plague, he was dying. A gentleman from Plymouth by the name of Edward Winslow put some herbs together, and Ed Winslow walked to Rhode Island to nurse Massasoit back to health. Ed Winslow walked 40 miles. Halfway there, he was met on a path by an Indian who told him not to bother finishing the trip. Massasoit died. Well, he finished the trip anyway. And he discovered Massasoit had not yet died. He was very close. And Ed Winslow nursed him back to health. From that day forward, they were great friends, and that peace treaty was even stronger. Now we'll move ahead 50 years. 50 years later, we had the King Philip War. Folks, King Philip was not a European. He was Massasoit's son. His Christian name was Philip. He went to negotiate not to go to war with the then governor of Plymouth, Josiah Winslow, Edward Winslow's son. While they're negotiating, Philip said to Winslow, he says, hey, I'm a chief. I'm a chief. You're just a governor. I'm not going to talk to you. I'll only talk to kings. They broke off the negotiations and went to war. From that day forward, Philip was referred to as King Philip because he would only talk to kings. And the two men who became great friends, their two sons went to war a generation later. See, folks, we did not pass that biblical education to the next generation. And what was the result? The largest percentage of population was killed in the King Philip War than any war in our country's history, and it could have been stopped. See, that's how important education is. That's how important passing down is. We have a wonderful Constitution. Are we passing it down to the next generation? Are we educating our kids right? Folks, whoever controls the kids controls the country. We need to educate our children properly. You see, Mark came and said, you're going to talk about the Pilgrims. Did they have anything to do with the Constitution? So I got to slip it in somewhere. The principles are what made the Constitution. The principles are what made the Declaration of Independence. And I'm honest with you, obviously I'm not shy about this. I talk about Christian principles. And I talk about Christian principles as the basis to our Constitution and our country. But I also talk about this with a lot of preachers, with a lot of people in the Christian community, and people say to me, you know what? The Declaration of Independence was anti-biblical. You see, you're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to rebel from your leaders. It's anti-biblical. I get this argument all the time from really good preachers, too. And they always quote a little passage to me. And some of you will be familiar with this. Romans 13, 1 and 2 states that every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those that which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. If you rebel against authority, you will get condemnation. So, folks, am I wrong doing this? Am I wrong telling you this? I don't believe I am, because there's a little issue. You see, government, in my opinion, and in the opinion of our founding fathers, for the most part, government is of God. He created government, but why did he create it? To overcome tyranny. And if government does not overcome tyranny but works into it, I believe we have a right to rebel from it. Not you as an individual, or you. Anybody ever heard of the Magna Carta? King John was a tyrant. So the Magna Carta was written by who? The bishops and the barons. Why? Because he was being a tyrant. So what they did is put together this document, the Magna Carta, and presented it to him as a magistrate lesser than him, but still a magistrate. And when a magistrate lesser than a magistrate who's being a tyrant can stand by the law and put together a document and give it to him, that is not destroying government, that's overthrowing tyranny. Because you did it within the government, which means you and I as an individual can't do that. But a lesser magistrate can do that. What happened with the Declaration of Independence? Lesser magistrates overcame the King of England. And they gave him a document. Those lesser magistrates, the founding fathers, our representatives, gave a document to the king. 26 violations the king did against them. Fix it, king. I'm not going to fix it. Fix it, English people. No. You have the right to rebel. And that's where our Declaration of Independence came from. I do not believe it is anti-biblical. I believe it's biblical. I believe government is from God to overthrow tyranny. So what we did, passing that down to the next generation, was biblical. But guys, you do not have a right to do that on your own. You don't have the right, really, to protest something, throw bricks through a window, set things on fire. You don't have that right. Not in a constitutional country. Not in a government run the way we're run. That is not right. I always get the argument, I have the right to say anything I want. You know what? Good. You have the right to say anything you want. But that doesn't make it right. You know what I like doing? I do this a lot. And I get people all riled up. And you know what I like doing? I like talking with them. I like having arguments. It's a lot of fun. But I will tell you this, if I disagree with you, I will not slander you. I will not attack you personally. If I don't like the way you do politics, I'll let you know. But I'm not going to tear you apart. See, we still have to have character of a good moral standing. And anybody can say to anybody else, you know what? I have the right to talk to you any way I want. Yeah, you do. Now, in my opinion, in a country like ours, the further we move away from God, I believe He's a God of order, the more chaos we experience. Anybody notice any chaos lately? Because we're moving away. But the more we move back, the less chaos we'll see. And I'll be honest with you again, I'm a Christian and I'm seeing the chaos, but I also believe secular people who are not of faith, are seeing the same thing. And in the end, it's going to affect everybody in a negative way. And we're going to come back. Mark just mentioned there might be another Supreme Court nominee. Anybody here want to be him? Why? We have chaos. We have disrespect. You know what else I talk about in Plymouth? It's kind of cool. I talk about capitalism. You know why I talk about capitalism? Because we started capitalism. Did you know when the Pilgrims originally came to Plymouth, their economic situation was communal? Yeah, everybody worked in the same field, grew their food, and at the end of the season they split evenly with each other what they produced. Sounds pretty fair, and of course it didn't work. So for the first 3 years they're starving to death because nobody's producing anything, there's no incentive. 3 years into the adventure, William Bradford changed to land ownership. Every family will own their own land, grow their own food, and feed themselves. Then they'll simply trade with each other what they had left over. Folks, we call that free trade. That happened to work. They never had a starving day after that. They tripled their production. Capitalism. You gotta love it. I love the opportunity to make as much money as I possibly can, but I also don't have a problem with failing. I'm okay with that, as long as I get the chance. But I'm gonna be honest with you folks, capitalism does not work. Nothing works without the number one commandment: love God, love your neighbor, and love yourself, because I'll tell you this, if I do not love you, I will take advantage of you. In capitalism. Capitalism on occasion gets a bad rap, doesn't it? Because we're taking advantage of each other. So guys, the point I think I'm making is if we can get back to these principles, we'll be a much stronger place. Because the principles work. And we need to teach integrity, morality, virtue to our children so they can carry the ball, so we can break out of what we're in. See, that's how important what the Pilgrims did, and that's why it's so important to pass it to the next generation and the next. Because if we don't, we end up with chaos. I had no idea this is where I was going tonight. Go figure, huh? This just happened. But it's so important, folks, because our Pilgrims did influence our founding fathers. And our founding fathers did build a country on Christian principles. I would have loved to have been there during the Continental Convention. Wouldn't you love to be there? To watch them bump heads, disagree, push each other around. I mean, come on. How many different attitudes, how many different perspectives did we have in that building? All of them. 13 different states. Amazing what they did. I'd have loved to have been there. I'd love to have been there when the Constitutional Convention was breaking down and an 86-year-old man stood up and looked at George Washington and said to George Washington, if a sparrow can't fall to the ground without God's notice, who do we think we are that we can start a country without God's help? That 86-year-old man was Benjamin Franklin.
reputedly the most religiously skeptical man in the convention.
Say that again?
I mean, the one founding father that is considered not a Christian, deist perhaps, or deist, was Benjamin Franklin. And it was him that proposed a prayer in the middle of the convention when things were getting rough.
Did you hear that? Did you hear it? So my question then, how could he be a deist?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I do know that he didn't belong to any particular denomination.
Exactly. So we call this revisionism. I believe he was, guys, if anybody calls you a free thinker, they just called you an atheist, okay? So I just wanted you to know that. So they called him a free thinker, right? I mean, look what the guy did. He invented everything. Virtually. The guy was unbelievable. Do you know he started 13 virtues? Did you know that? That he wrote down on a piece of paper, and he had a line for each virtue? And what he did is he said, I'm going to overcome all these things, so I'm going to be perfect. So what he did is he starts with the first virtue. For a week, he practiced that. And once he got it down, he went to the next virtue. He started practicing that, but he found out he just broke the first virtue. So he had to go back to the first virtue to fix it, to go back to the second virtue, and do that. Now he's got the second virtue, goes to the third, he broke all three. At the end of the day, he said, you know what? I don't think I can do this. I'm a little better than I was yesterday, but I don't think I can be perfect. And then a Quaker, he's from Pennsylvania, Benjamin Franklin, a Quaker friend went up to him and said, you got to add a 14th virtue. He said, what's that? The Quaker said to him, humility. He said, you're right. But I have a funny feeling if I conquer humility, I'll be proud about it. He thought he could be perfect, but he can't. But he was a great man. Anybody here have bifocals? Blame it on Benjamin Franklin. Franklin stove, Benjamin Franklin. You ever go to the library? Benjamin Franklin. Firehouse, Benjamin Franklin. Invented all those.
Invented what? He invented what?
First firehouse, library, bifocals.
He's at the beginning of the basic principles of electricity.
A good principle.
Faraday. He's the first important scientist in the end of the Enlightenment on electricity.
Yeah, that's right. He's an incredible man. Incredible man. And so this is where we ended up. This is what happened. But now when we got back to, let's get back to the Pilgrims for 1 minute. How much time do I have left?
About 20 minutes.
20 minutes, okay. Let's get back to the Pilgrims again. So the Pilgrims built this incredible community. And did you folks know that the separatists came on the Mayflower? Did you know they weren't the only group? Did you know there was another group of people on the Mayflower? About half and half. We had the separatists, they were called the Saints. We had another group coming for other reasons. They were called the Strangers. Now, being a stranger is not a derogatory term. If you and I were in a different congregation in the 1600s, we refer to each other as strangers. So that doesn't even mean they were devoid of faith. They just weren't in our congregation. But I'm also sure you folks know we landed in the wrong place. We weren't supposed to land on Cape Cod. It's where you go on vacation. We were supposed to land in Northern Virginia. We had no law to be here. So when we landed here, the strangers looked at the Saints and said, you know what, we don't really like you people. We're not sitting under your rule, we're leaving. Nothing you can do about it, no law to keep us here. They were right, except they just landed on the tip of a sandbar in the middle of an ice storm, 102 people and absolutely nothing else. Half are going to leave. John Carver said, you will not sit under our rule, we will have self-rule. Every man on this boat gets a vote. But once a vote's taken, everybody follows that person, whether you voted for him or not. He was unanimously elected the first governor of Plymouth. Unanimously. Anybody see a miracle just pop up? Those separatists were not just not like us, they did not like us. How would you tell the separatists? From a stranger, separatists would have a Geneva Bible. Stranger, King James Bible. Anglican, we did not like Anglicans. And this guy gets unanimously elected. Imagine negotiating power. Unbelievable. We signed a peace treaty with the Indians that lasted 55 years. And we stole Indians as slaves. Before that, they didn't trust us. Yet we signed a peace treaty. Incredible negotiating power. Edward Winslow healed Massasoit from the plague. Guys, how do you sign a peace treaty? When you have a river, one hill, the other hill, Bradford, Massasoit, staring at each other. Bradford says, come on over, we'll have a little smoke and we'll sign a peace treaty. Massasoit says, I'm on the way. It's the second after you send a hostage over here that stays till I come back. That hostage was Edward Winslow. And he stayed with the Indians till the peace sign was signed, and then he went back. Incredible diplomat. Unfortunately, his son was not. Probably the worst. But you see what I'm talking about, folks? A human story. And when we get to our founding fathers, who are some called deists, Franklin, Jefferson, I don't believe they were, but they are called deists.
I thought he was a deist.
What's that?
I thought he was very peculiar kind of Christian.
Who?
Jefferson.
You know what was wrong with Jefferson? He was honest. Do you want to confuse people? Go in the room and tell them what you're all about. You'll confuse them. Yeah, he was up and down. He was all over the map at different periods in his life. But he did write the Declaration of Independence.
I wanted to ask you a question.
Sure.
Well, we were talking about a question of whether the Declaration was biblical or not. Now, I've heard arguments that it is biblical, and I have heard arguments that it is, let us say, abiblical. But you forward, there are some people that say, or assert that it is anti-biblical. I'm kind of curious, who are these people? Which ones, where does that come from?
That said the Declaration of Independence was anti-biblical, that you don't rebel against the king. There's one famous pastor, what's his name, John? He's real famous. Obviously not that famous because I can't remember his name. John.
Is he a current pastor or a...
Current.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. I just can't remember his name, but there are a bunch of pastors and people that just stick by that. At the time, during the Declaration of Independence, at that time, the writing, the Quakers believed that also, that it was anti-biblical. You do not rebel against your leaders. But it was proven with the Magna Carta and that interposition where people interpose themselves between the illegal leader to go.
No, 10 minutes.
Okay, and them that it was not biblical, but it is a biblical document. We have certain inalienable rights that come from God. Hard to fight that one. You know, does the Constitution have any biblical quotes in it? No. But it came together because of Christian principles, because of faith principles. You see, guys, my friend John Jenney that built the Grist Mill started Capitalism. He's the first person in the country to be paid for a service. Capitalism began in that grist mill that I ran for 10 years. But he also started regulations. They regulated him. He couldn't overcharge for his product. He could only get 2 quarts every time he ground a bushel. Oh, by the way, he got paid in corn, not money. He could only get 2 quarts every time he ground a bushel. If he charged more than that, he'd be kicked out of the mill. Why do we have to have regulations? Because we're human. And we all have a tendency to push it a little, don't we? That's why 3 branches of government. We have to check on each other, don't we? Is the Constitution biblical? Of course it is. We have to check on each other. We also have to have it written down. I get a lot of pushback telling these stories because people say to me, how do you know all that? Where's your primary document? Well, William Bradford wrote a book called Plymouth Plantation. Everything I tell you comes right out of the book, a primary document. But I also have people say, you know what? You can't trust primary documents. You know what? You know what his book is? It's a commercial for people to come to Plymouth, and they're making it look good. So they'll come. Morse relations, same thing. Primary document, oh, they're just making it look good, so they'll come. Are you kidding me? 102 people came, 51 died. They almost starved to death for the first 3 years. That sounds good. Pack our bags, guys, let's go. There you go. That's very unsettling, Mark. But they also say you can trust word of mouth. Anybody do the telephone game? Yeah. Can't trust word of mouth. But we do have the primary documents. We can tell people exactly what happened. But folks, in the end, a lot of people ask me, did the Pilgrims really have anything to do with the first Thanksgiving? And they did. That first season they had a decent harvest. Not great, but certainly enough food to get through the winter. They thought they ought to thank God for that. But not only that, they felt Massasoit was so instrumental in their survival that they should invite Massasoit and his immediate family to that celebration, and they did. Unfortunately, nobody explained to Massasoit the meaning of immediate family. He brought 99 braves. There goes the food. But he did bring 6 deer. They had venison, turkey, fish, vegetable. They had enough food for a 3-day celebration where they honored one another and became better friends. But just so they would not forget what they had been through for the first course of that 3-day meal, legend has it, Governor Bradford put a 1/4 pound of cornbread on everybody's plate and asked everybody there to give him one thing they were thankful for that first year in Plymouth. That was our first Thanksgiving. And that, folks, what I just explained to you, is what I call the Reader's Digest version to the town of Plymouth. Any questions?
What one book would you recommend for someone beginning to study the Pilgrims?
Again, I have, at our shop, we do have William Bradford's book of Plymouth Plantation, well footnoted, which is a good thing because it's written in Old English. Very hard to read. But we have another book called The Pilgrim Chronicles that a man took and brought it up to, he has all this Bradford stuff written and then he explains it next to it. Very well done. And it really explains the whole story of the Pilgrims. Definitely worth getting. Yeah. Any other questions? Wow, no questions, huh?
Don't leave, don't get up.
Yeah, really?
So this is our last meeting of the year, and so we have Thanksgiving and Christmas in front of us. And every year when I sit down at the Thanksgiving table, it's not difficult to think of the things that we're thankful for and blessed with. And tonight, we've been blessed with Leo, a real treasure.
Thank you.
America.
Thank you very much.
And so I just want to sign off by thanking everybody who's listening online, and to all of you, just a wonderful Merry Christmas and a Happy Hanukkah. Go with health and with Godspeed. Thank you.
Thank you.